Thank you, Sarah, and thanks to the whole HIDA team that has put this together. It's been a pleasure working with them. Also want to thank you all for being here and for doing the work you're doing. Every one of you are doing important prevention work in your communities and wanting to come and get some more skills to advance that work. I was really impressed with the presentations yesterday. Billy, Carl, and Robert learned a lot from them. And some of the things I'm going to be talking about reinforce or might seem to be saying a similar thing, but I think it's important because I'm going to be talking about the context of schools and prevention. And so that kind of thing. But also I had some of the Protected Schools books out on the counter. I don't have enough for all the participants, but we are working on a website. We're transitioning from one host to another. And if you've ever done that technical stuff, it never goes smoothly. And I hope to have that up for today. I don't. And hopefully we can get the team to send that information out as to how you can access online the Protected Schools book, the PSA that goes with it, and other kinds of things that I'll be talking about later. I'd also like to have two things of full disclosure. Last week, I had emergency oral surgery and removed two of my front teeth because of infected root canals. So I can either write the dentist a really big check or wait for Christmas, but that's why I have the mask on. And that the other part of the full disclosure is in August of 2019, I received a call that no one wants to receive. My husband said, "We've got to go see Tom and Tanya. Something's happened with Kaylee." So we went to the house, and what had happened with Kaylee is she had died from a cocaine overdose. What had happened is that she had cocaine issues. The parents, her siblings, and her boyfriend had worked with a therapist to have a meeting with her to confront her on that 2 weeks before she died. And things seemed to be moving along. She moved in with her folks because she and her boyfriend were having a problem basically because of the addiction. The night before she died, she was sitting out on the patio looking at the Arizona stars. She texted a friend to confirm that they were meeting for lunch the next day. She threw a load of wash in the washer, went to bed, and never woke up. So it's a huge, I debated about telling this because I know I was going to cry, but it's a huge thing in our family. As you can imagine, Mother's Day, two grandmothers and a mother were at a cemetery. So I'm sure that there are people within hearing that may know of someone who has had the situation or had a similar situation. And although I've been doing this work since the late 70s, early 80s, it gives me a renewed enthusiasm for it and a renewed hope that so many of you are out here also doing this work, and also that we know so much more than what we knew in the 70s. So I would like to I have a little, so again, prevention, to make sure we're on the same page, which we simply are. It's an active process, okay? That's what you guys are going to be doing, active process of creating conditions in your community. And I've been focusing on the conditions within the school system, as well as personal attributes that promote the well-being of people. So effective prevention leads to the well-being, positive youth development, the well-being of people, and we're particularly interested right now in youth. So I'm going to talk about the history of prevention, which puts into context what prevention science. When I say we, I'm talking about the prevention field, which has grown enormously, which is great. But what we knew and what strategies we were using. I'm also an amateur neuroscientist. I love the idea of understanding how the brain works and how the brain processes information, because when you know that, you can have some more assurance about the evidence-based programs that you're using. So I have a little quiz for you. So if you take 2 minutes and write down what are the answers to these questions, Who was the first president to fund drug abuse, fund drug prevention? When was the first national survey of high school seniors on drug use? Just Say No was associated with which first lady? And who was the first person to be titled drug czar? That should be in the United States. So just write down some of those answers. Let's see how we do with that. Okay, I see most of the pens, oh, a second, are down. Who was the first president to fund drug prevention in a big way? Anybody? Ronald Reagan? Pardon? Ford? Richard Nixon with the drug-free schools, Title IV drug-free school. So Richard Nixon. He's known for a lot of bad things, but as preventionists, we can say that he was in that. Well, what was the date of the first national survey of high school seniors drug use? Am I giving a decade? Anybody? 1990? Okay, anybody before? It's before that. 1975. NIDA was formed, Zoe just told me, in 1974. And there were already some preliminary surveys being done. That's a long time ago. And we sure know a whole lot more than we did in 1975. Just Say No is associated with which first lady? Nancy Reagan. And who was the first person to be titled drug czar? Bill Bennett was one, yeah. It's a guy named Harry Anslinger, who was drug czar from 1930 to 1962. So it's the idea, and that was where he was given that title of drug czar. So I want to, when I talk about the history of prevention in terms of strategies that we as the prevention science community use, one of the first things was this information only. And we had, and sometimes these came out of police departments. They had a picture that showed different drugs, and someone would come in and say, well, this is this kind of drug, and this is this kind of drug. And they'd say, these are the things that are positive about it, and these are the things that are negative about it. And this is, many of them were prescription drugs. But they say, well, a pink Cadillac will give you will make you feel very high, and you will not take responsibility. You'll just be, it's a good party drug. And then they'd say, and for 12 hours afterwards, you have a splitting headache and may vomit. So the adolescent brain, what do they hear? Oh, that sounds terrific. And I don't care. I'll take it on Friday. I'll stay home on Saturday. I'll be sick. I won't have to do the jobs that my family wants me to do. This isn't such a bad thing. And what we found in evaluation of these in the 70s and 80s is this information only of this kind of information was not effective. It actually was counter-effective. And then scaring kids. Kids just don't like to be scared. In terms of, this is a rotten lung. This is a lung of a smoker that died of cancer. He died at 55. I can smoke now, and then I'll stop anytime I want to. So it doesn't really affect me. And so then we tried values clarification. And so it was to have people say, well, what are your values? My values, I want to go to college, I want a good job, I want to get married and have children, but I also want to have a great time. And so I clarify my values and say, right now, or getting a job, being trustworthy, those kinds of things, those are in the future. I want to have a good time. So really the values clarification reinforced their desire to have a good time and to move forward on that. We also presented someone that had been in rehab and had come out of rehab, and that he or she appeared on the stage. They were really cool. Well, I'll use drugs for a little bit, and then I'll go into rehab, and I'll get better, and look at the kind of support I'll be getting, and I'll just deal with it in detox. No big deal. So I don't need to do that. So community coalitions is something that were very popular in the early 70s and 80s. And one of the things that's different now from what we're talking about in terms of coalitions today is that we didn't know a lot about bringing people together. We didn't know a lot about due process. We didn't have a planning process. So oftentimes the mayor called them together or the hospital called them together. But there wasn't any really good sense of what we know about prevention or prevention science that we know now. And so they're talking about a poster contest. Why don't we do the grant required that we meet this week? But really not any kind of expertise and knowledge base in the community coalition. Then we had the just say no, that if kids were given refusal skills and that was it, just refusal skills, or they had a lot of rallies, they had Red Ribbon Week, these things were isolated incidents that didn't change the culture, didn't change the community, but were kind of gadgets and things that we now know that we can put science behind them, that we can make them part of some other larger endeavor and have them be more effective. Refusal skills were created by people who thought that the way kids got to use drugs was somebody older wanted to sell them drugs and so tried to engage them in that. That was, oops, I didn't do it. Don't. And that we know, we learned from research. That's what it was formed at the time. People didn't know. The use in research is what kids often did is their whole peer culture, their whole peer group decided at 15, 16, 17. Well, we ought to be experimenting. We ought to figure out what this is about. Not that somebody was a bully and influenced them the way the people that developed some of the curriculum thought was the case. So in the 1980s, we came up with the idea of risk and protective factors. So that kids that were exposed to the same circumstances, some of them were involved in drugs and others weren't. So what were the differences in terms of understanding what were the risk factors and what were the protective factors and working on balancing those out? And so a lot of programs were involved in heightening the protective factors and trying to reduce the risk factors. We knew more about the risk factors because we were more of a deficit-oriented culture than we did about the protective factors. But as time has gone on, we've learned a lot more about the protective factors. Then there was the upstream intervention, also which we talked about yesterday. There is a tremendous book that it's very easy to read by Dan Heath called Upstream that talks about where do you want to put your emphasis? Where do you want to put your program emphasis? And it goes back to an old prevention story that I learned way back when about Irma and Ole, who retired in Arizona to the White Mountains, and they had built this beautiful cabin next to a creek. And on this cabin, can you imagine this cabin with a front porch? And they'd sit out there after dinner and have their coffee on this beautiful front porch and this next listening to the creek. Well, one night there was a baby that was floating down the river. And so Ole got up and ran to the creek and saved the baby. And 3 nights later, there was another baby that came down, floating down the creek, drowning. And so Ole got up and jumped and went out and saved the kid. 4 days later, there's another one coming down. Ole got off the porch, ran the other direction. And Irma said, Ole, what are you doing? He says, I'm going upstream to find the bastard who's throwing the kid to the creek. And so there are several points at which you can do prevention. And this is the upstream interventions are policy approaches that affect larger populations. So that is including regulation, increased access, decreased access, economic incentives. So we have a menu of things that we are doing, that we can do, and the menu of kind of understanding the neuroscience of the adolescent brain that says the way it was presented in 1975, which was information only, about the pros and cons of each individual drug may not have been effective then because of the way that the adolescent brain worked and the way we presented it. But what if, as NIDA has done a curriculum on neuroscience and addiction, what if we had science teachers present information about the neuroscience of addiction, how the brain, showing PET scans and other kinds of things, would that information be effective? We don't know. We need, as Robert was talking about yesterday, it's an emerging science. And it has been an emerging science ever since we started this process. And we've done the evaluation and said, this is problematic, this is helpful, this is the way we ought to go. So I am going to be focusing on that first part, which is a blank screen, no, which is if you want to change conditions. If you want to change conditions, you can change people. And where does this research come from? This is a saying that I like to use a lot, is when a flower doesn't bloom, we change the environment in which it grows, the soil, the light, the water, not the flower. We don't blame the flower for not growing. Why not? What we do is we change the environment, and that's what we're going to be talking about in terms of climate in schools. So the untapped power of schools to improve the health of teens, we developed the concept of connectedness. And this comes from a major study of 90,000 adolescents that were followed for 4 waves by first of all, the University of Minnesota, Dr. Robert Blum, and then now he's moved to Johns Hopkins University and he's a pediatrician and created the concept of connectedness. So what is connectedness? Being connected to school doesn't mean you're a cheerleader or a football player or on the honor roll. It means that you have these characteristics. You feel close to the people at your school. You feel happy to be at school. You feel like you're part of the school, and the students are treated fairly in your school, and that you feel safe. So these are the concepts of what goes into connectedness. It's one of those sort of things. It's a sort of bonding, it's attachment, and it doesn't depend on you can feel these things even if you're never on the football team or play any sport, if you're never in student council, if you never have any kind of formal position at the school, close to people, happy to be there, part of the school. This one, the fourth one is one I think is really important, which students are treated fairly. Not I am treated fairly, but I see other students being treated fairly. And I think this is budding social justice issue that's covered in this one, and that I feel safe in school. So that's what we're looking at connectedness. Now, it's the untapped power. This idea of connectedness is the untapped power of schools. And so here are the data that illustrate this. So if we look at 0 as the average, okay, and we see that for marijuana, cigarettes, and alcohol, kids that are not connected are one standard deviation more likely to be involved with all alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana. And as you feel more connected, you are significantly less likely to use those 3 substances. So what Dr. Blum found, and why they call their study the untapped power of schools to help students, to help teen health, is that this is more powerful than any individual curriculum or program or any individual thing that is happening. We don't know what, at this point in time, which was in the 1990s, late 1990s, we don't know what made kids feel connected. We've done some research, we now have some ideas on that. But at this point, we didn't know. We just knew that this school climate was very, very powerful in terms of prevention. Okay, well, that's alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs. Then how about violence and deviant behavior? Absolutely the same pattern. So deviant behavior was sometimes measured by referrals, and violence was measured by self-report. But here we go again. If you were not at all connected, you were much more likely to be involved in both of these behaviors than if you were well connected. And the other thing is that it was regraded. The more connected you felt, the less you were involved in this. And then emotional, for the internal issues, suicide and emotional stress. Again, the same pattern. The degree of connectedness leads to more or less behavior. So what Dr. Blum said in 2005 is when students feel that they're part of the school, that they're treated fairly by their teachers, and they feel close to people at the school, they are healthier and more likely to succeed. So it's very clear as an educator, prevention scientist person, this is where I needed to put my time. We needed to be getting federal funding to support this, which we did. So this is taken from the resiliency literature. And so what are the things a school can do, educators can do to increase bonding and connectedness? And this is taken from Nan Henderson's research on resiliency. And so there are things, and I am 90% sure that if you are in a school or the schools in your community are doing some of these things. What I'm going to be talking about is how to do them intentionally. How to do them intentionally, and what does that work? So teaching life skills. We have talked about teaching life skills in terms of refusal skills, in terms of friendship skills, and some of the curriculum there. Showing care and concern, and that really comes down to relationships. And we can talk a little bit about that. Establishing clear and consistent boundaries. Is the school well organized? Do kids know what behaviors are acceptable and what aren't? And what are the consequences for acceptable behavior and unacceptable behavior are handed out equitably? Provide opportunities for meaningful participation in where there's a whole set of literature that's coming out now about student voice and getting students involved in the decision-making process. And last is having high supported expectations. You don't just say, well, every kid can learn. You have to really put in what supports do you have for children that have missed school because of illness, or for children who don't learn in the conventional ways. What supports do you have for these children? So we know the connectedness is a really important protective factor, and connectedness to school. We have some strategies that will be helpful. And in many of these, there are evidence-based programs, but there are programs that also have good science behind them. So they have not had a randomized control trial. They have science behind them that we need to pay attention to. So here's how it works. School climate, a positive school climate, leads to student connectedness, which leads to outcomes. And we can say, if there's not connected, we know what those outcomes are. If they are connected, we know what those outcomes are. And we want the outcomes for kids that are related to a positive climate, are related to positive connectedness. So back in 1998, I started at the University of Arizona, and I had done work on changing individual behavior before then. I spent several decades at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, working with engineers, love them to death, in terms of using computers to give health information. We got awards. But I also noticed that I read this literature, and then I go to schools, and I see that these programs were not being used. So I brought a team together of experts in health education, in special education and administration, prevention science. I brought my boss at CDC down, and we said, well, what's the next generation? What do we need to do? How do we operationalize the school connected system? And so we came up with a model called Protected Schools. And I brought some of the books, it was in 2000, I brought some of the books with me and then I will also get the website so you can download a PDF if you want to. And so what is a protected school? The idea was that it is a system. Schools are systems. And that if you're going to have prevention that sticks, you're going to need to engage all of these systems. So like, what is funding and resources have to do with prevention? Well, is there a line item for purchasing curriculum? Is that a line item? Is that a line item in your budget, your school district budget? Or is that because you get a 3-year grant? And when the grant money goes away, that goes away. What about professional development? What are the core principles of prevention that your staff needs to know? Because the way your teachers teach, the kind of relationships your teachers have in class is showing care and concern, is a major contributor to connectedness. So what are the professional development pieces that are there? And it was interesting because half the room was prevention scientists, the science folks, but they put a research-based prevention at very low on the list after leadership, after continuing services, after homeschool community relationships, after climate and culture. So these are the components that we need to be considered when in terms of our what's going on in our school, what are the different systems that are involved. And we would have, if you look at your organization, which I'd like to have you do, is think about your organization and make a list of the systems that you would have to impact to create lasting change and prevention. What are the systems within the police department, within a public health organization, within a school? We have sort of for those of you who are school people, but maybe in your school in terms of your district. What are the systems within your organization that would have to have a change or education or learning that you would need to, oops, it's a very sensitive little thing, that you could need to impact in order to make prevention stick in your organization. You could also do that for what systems would you need to engage in a community coalition. But I think I'd like you to take 5 minutes or 3 minutes and think about what all the systems are in your organization that either you now impact or you would need to impact to make prevention stick. So I'll interrupt at 1:15. What? No, I'm asking people to write down what systems in their organization would impact getting a prevention intervention going and making it stick. Those of you that are online, if you want to put a couple things in the chat, then my good colleagues Laura and Patty can share that as well. What are the systems that you would need to impact or educate or get involved in your organization? Okay, so I've been reminded to remind you to put it either in the Q&A box or the chat box, what you're thinking for your, and also you probably ought to say what your organization is. So if it's a police department, public health organization, an NGO, whatever the organization, whatever it is. Okay, I'm going to ask Patty to read. We'll do back and forth. And we'll start with someone from the virtual classroom and then come to somebody here. And so I'm hoping that we can have volunteers that would represent different types of organizations. So Patty, what did you got?
So we have one of our participants mentioned community support for prevention initiatives. One of the bigger concerns seeming to be lack of support, and also leadership understanding of upstream versus one and done initiatives that quote look like we are doing something about the issue.
Okay, and that was from what agency?
Let's scroll down. The person did not indicate the agency.
Okay, all right. So someone in here that's not from a school would want to just volunteer to read their list quickly. You can do this. You can do this. I saw you writing. I'm going to look at my friend in the raspberry colored jacket.
I kind of serve a couple of aspects. I am with the school though. Go ahead. Project Aware. So I think I also serve on the city council in our community, which is Wyoming. And I think there's a greater need out there for education, including the broader. So I think that a lot of people in this room, we work for government agencies or school agencies, and we're doing the work and we get barriers, understand all that stuff. But I think that bringing in people and educating the community members that include, you know, bankers, big corporations, and people of that nature to help break down some of these relational issues that we have within our community. And I think we'll do a good job of getting those relationships built and those protective factors built. We need to be better because we have to turn the page on some things that are not working. And so I think that if we could bring in a larger community that doesn't something with speakers, I think would be ideal.
Okay, great. And then we'll go to our chat or the Q&A. Patty?
Yes, and that first respondent did indicate that they were from the school. We have another respondent who indicated they're from a local prevention organization. They offer a number of clubs and groups for schools and indicated that more of this type of work is certainly necessary and needed. The scroll is getting the best of me, you all. But that in a nutshell covers it, specifically things like educational, art, and music activities.
And then the question is, what systems need to be in place in order to do that? What do they need to do within their organization in order to make that happen? So we've heard from the school, we've heard from a community. I'll say that you represent both of them, and we've heard from a prevention organization. I'd love to hear from someone who's a police officer from law enforcement. If we could have a volunteer in the room that would be kind enough to share what systems in your department.
Well, they're thinking about that. We also have somebody from a public safety representative that I've been online, works in juvenile justice and oversees substance use programs within the facility. Indicated that what would be needed with things like commitment from leadership on all various levels, adequate staffing, committed staff, and finding the time in the school day.
Time for educators is the most precious commodity. One more here from whatever you are. I know you're writing. Do not be shy.
Yeah,
But we have a volunteer back there. Thank you. My former partner from yesterday.
Well, I work with the Veterans Funding Collaborative Program. If you're unfamiliar with that, my role is to engage all the stuff within the community, so we're good, and all that. And what that book is prevention. So working with the system, we're already very collaborating with stuff. Really want to prevent physical health department, mental health department, recreational, public, all of that. Just working with student partners that are already doing the work, figuring out how we create that.
Excellent, thank you. And do you have another one? You're gonna share, okay. So, yeah, within your department, within your group, I should say, if anyone else here want to share. Thank you. Within your organization, you have these same systems. And so you think about in terms of what are the challenges working with some of those systems to get them engaged in prevention. What are they already doing that support you, and how can you support them in doing more of the same or less of the things that don't work? So I'd like to just go down these systems within schools, because one of the reasons that I hooked up in prevention, that if you ever look at the authors in prevention, there are very few of us who are also educators. And yet many of the interventions that we are interested in involve schools. Schools are where the kids are, that's one thing. And initially in the early prevention, when we thought education, tell them drugs are bad, they won't do them. That fallacy was that people that knew how to teach kids were in school. But they also are where they are. And we also know now that school climate where the kids are every day, 5 hours a day, makes a huge difference. So I'm going to go through these systems within schools and talk a little bit about them, and then talk a little bit about our work. A vision, a commonly held belief system, help you move in the same direction. And if you don't have a vision, if you don't have a mission statement, then you have people who can't assume that they're all going in the same direction. Climate, the definition for climate is that it reflects the school's norms, goals, values, relationships, teaching practices, discipline practices, and organizational structures. I can walk into a school and know whether the positive or negative nature of the climate, just by walking in and seeing how people are greeted, seeing the degree of organization in the lobby, seeing if there is student work on the walls, or if it's all negative kinds of deficit stuff. So, in terms of the schools that you have, these are the important things in terms of the climate. It's accepting and inclusive, provides opportunities for all, that there are strong relationships, and that is well organized. Leadership is working with people in an organization to get things done. And so a leader needs to be committed to the process and be able to move forward. Besides positional leaders, there are principals, assistant principals, deans, there are informal leaders, and we'll talk about how we engage informal leaders in terms of leadership teams. And leadership needs to tap into the power of people working together, not feeling like they have to control others. There needs to be strong academics. For schools, they are there to teach children. They're there to teach children content. They're there to teach children, to prepare them for citizenship. And that is their main goal. And so many times you walk into a principal's office and say, what about a good drug prevention program? And they'll say, thank you very much, Dr. Bosworth, we'll call you. But if I go in and talk about various learning, if I talk about school safety, if I talk about having retaining teachers in terms of creating climates that are positive. Here's the key things about strong academics. Emphasis on basic skills, high expectations with support. So the state of Florida enacted a law that said that if you weren't reading at a certain level by 3rd grade, you had to repeat 3rd grade. They put into that, before that law, they had a lot of poverty mitigation strategies. They had a lot of tutoring in K1 and 2. And so very, very few students didn't pass the bar. The great state of Arizona put in the same rule. Move on when reading. You don't read at grade level at 3rd grade, and remember grade level of an average. You don't read at grade level at 3rd grade, you repeat 3rd grade. But the state of Arizona did not put in any of those supports, none of those safety nets. And so it turned out to be a total miserable failure in terms of, there was one school, 90% of their 3rd graders were supposed to repeat 3rd grade. So that's the support piece. Very teaching techniques and learning styles, and read well by 3rd or 4th grade. So research-based prevention is something that we've talked about, and it is the gold standard. But you have to start with where people are. And you have to realize that there has to be a pretty sophisticated amount of information within the culture to engrave a evidence-based program that's going to last beyond the grant. And so one of the things that you need to do is take people where they are and what is there. So what's professional wisdom? What's widespread practice? Some of this may be bunk, but you may need to start with that. What's expert opinion and best practice? When we started working on climate interventions, it was research-based, it was expert opinion, and we took it to the evidence-based level. One of our big grants, I think it was like $12 million, was the Safe and Supportive Schools grant, which was for high schools. There were no evidence-based drug prevention programs aimed at high schools at the time. So what we did is created a cocktail. We went to the educational literature. The one evidence-based program was a student assistance program, but it wasn't prevention, it was secondary prevention. So we had a cocktail of programs. We went to the literature on student voice and pulled in that. And we also took communities that care and adapted the materials for schools. And so this brochure talks about how we put a cocktail together of some evidence, some theory-based programs that covered the continuum of services for high school students and got very strong effects. So this is a continuum of services. If you know positive behavior intervention support, the triangle will look very familiar to you. But universal interventions are for all students, all settings. They're proactive and they're preventive. Targeted groups, targeted interventions are sometimes they're called tier 2, are for some students that are high risk. They're high efficiency and a rapid response. And for a small number of students, you need intensive individual interventions. And you could say the same thing in terms of education. You can say the same things in terms of dentistry. You know, I'm a perfect example of somebody at the high level, but for the most part, brushing your teeth on a regular basis, having fluoride in the water, going to see the dentist, that's good enough for everybody. Once a year, go see the dentist. Well, then we might get a couple of cavities, and that's at the second level. We go to a specialist, we get the cavities drilled out, and then you have horrible teeth like mine, and it's a generation thing. My father lost all of his teeth in the 50s, and then you need more intense interventions. And so this is for academics learning math. You have a general curriculum. Everybody gets it. Some people miss out, and you need some tutoring to get them back on track. Others, like me, are totally out of my mind about numbers, and I need intensive intervention like graduate school. So at any rate, this is the continuum of services, and this is borrowed from PBIS, positive behavior intervention support, in terms of what that's used. So again, as we put the cocktail together, we're taking information from other things. Professional development, and one of the things that one of our principals told us, that schools must be exciting learning places for adults who work there, because you can only teach what you know. And if you're not excited about learning, if you're not a learner, it's harder to engage that in students. And so we have talked about, I've worked on the universal prevention curriculum with Lily and others in terms of how we teach prevention scientists more about prevention basics. And what you're doing today is exactly what we need to have happen. And you share that knowledge, each one teach one kind of thing back in your local organizations. And we have materials. I'm diverting a bit. The materials that these folks have put together are excellent. So take a look at them when you go back at night. They really give you a lot of good information, a lot of science-based information. Strong professional development is content focused. There's active learning, and that there's collective participation. There's a business change researcher named Peter Senge. And Peter Senge talks about learning organizations. And how do you get a learning organization? Is you have lots of people involved who work together learning at the same time. And so like your leadership teams, your faculty, they're all learning at the same time, bringing the same material rather than sending someone off and having them come back and being the local expert. Home and school and community relationships, we talk about how to get families involved, and that has always been a challenge. There are levels of kinds of involvement, that come from communicating, volunteering, those kinds of things that have specific interventions. And we have one evidence, and I don't know if it's on the Colorado list, called Parents as Teachers in elementary school, where you teach parents to be prevention specialists. Again, you have to be involved in the systems in order to do that. So funding and resources, always a problem. It's always been that treatment gets more money and then prevention does forever and ever. But who's involved in the decision making? How is the spending aligned with your vision? And are you spending things on things that have the best chance of working? And so that's important too. And while data decision making and needs assessments, setting goals and objectives, identifying research-based programs and evaluation. I think you heard that at least 10 times yesterday. So this is not anything new, but in getting it going is another situation. So we created the model, we created a book, we sent it out, and then we got a grant to implement it. And so how do we go about doing that? And we had done remember I worked for engineers, and they had did some strategies on multi-attribute utility models, where when you don't have research to identify pinpoint the issue, you bring a bunch of experts together and make and develop a strategy. And so here's the strategies that we developed that we honed in on many of our grants. We have to have leadership and staff commitment. Staff commitment on an anonymous survey had to be 80%. If it wasn't 80%, we would not go in and do the work because we would have too many distractors among the faculty to get things done. And then when the schools that we had less than 80%, we would go in and work with that school, that principal, if they wanted to continue. We did an assessment, the Protective School Assessment that we created based on those 10 factors. We had a team that identified the 3 factors that they thought were most important. And then we let the staff brainstorm on what was working, what did they want to goal, and what did they think needed to happen. It went back to the core team who reviewed it and looked at evidence-based practice. They drafted an action plan. They went back to the full staff and said, do you approve this? Because we needed engagement, continual engagement from the staff. And then they implemented, monitored, and evaluated. And that's what you're going to hear about this afternoon, about steps on doing that kind of a process. This is what we gave them back as a report card on their Protected Schools assessment. And I picked this one out because the average score in over, I think, 128 schools that we worked with, the average score was somewhere between 67 and 7 when you started. The average score when we ended working with us was 88. So we could move that. And so you could see, as a planning core team, you could see where you would want to build on. And what we said, well, for example, if your culture, if your professional development is green and going great guns, how do you keep it that? So it wasn't only that you looked at the family community relationships because that was your lowest score, but you might want to look at the highest score and say, okay, you've done this, we can't just go like this and not forget about it, but we need to move forward. This is one school, a middle school that worked with us for, from, I guess this is 9 years of data. And you can see how there were some changes along the way. And you can tell, I would say in number 8, they had a change of principal. So you have those leadership issues that come and go. But this is very reinforcing for people in that area. So I'm now going to talk about, we've talked about prevention science, we've talked about neuroscience and the adolescent brain, we've talked about the power of culture, climate within the schools. Now I'd like to take it to today, the issue of novel use opioid and fentanyl crisis that we're having today. The word is novel because it is a totally different type of dynamic than what we have seen since 1975. And so whereas we are not yet, it's an emerging science, and we need to be doing evaluation and research on it. We need to be taking best practice. We need to be taking theory-based. We need to be taking our evidence-based strategies and testing them again, because this is a different story. And so let me talk about how that's a different story. teen use for all substances is declining. It's declining past pre-pandemic levels or remaining stable. Then you get this data from Monitoring the Future. You can go in and Google Monitoring the Future, and they will give you the report. You can go in and get more details if you ever want to know. But just the big picture is that we are not having a crisis in increasing drug use across the board. It is the cannabis use. Everybody say, oh, marijuana with the states legalizing it. The cannabis use has remained stable. 8th graders, 8%, 10th graders, 20%, and 30% of seniors. This is stable. So what is different? Why are kids dying of opioids? Because it's becoming more dangerous. Between 2019 and 2021, the overdose deaths increased by 30%. That's a huge increase. 90% of overdose deaths, this is where the T's come in, overdose deaths are involved opioid. You know what I mean, okay? Fentanyl is associated with 77% opioid deaths. Okay, so my granddaughter Kaylee did not have fentanyl in her system. She just had opium in her system. The majority of drug overdose deaths are unintentional. So there's not the individual behavior part of the equation doesn't seem to hold. So what is happening? What's the connection between opioid and fentanyl deaths? Why do we have that? One of the main connections is mental health disorder, specifically internalizing disorders like depression and overdose. We don't know the causal direction. Is it that if you take opioids, you're more depressed, or you're depressed, so you take opioids to feel better? We don't have the research yet to know what the causal, to know what that, if one causes the other, or if in some cases it works for some students one way and others we don't know that kind of stuff. What is dangerous? Why it's dangerous is that fentanyl becomes mixed with other drugs. So a young person does not know he or she is taking fentanyl. And also we have long known that white adolescents are more likely to use drugs, are more likely to initiate earlier drug use than any other racial category. That the age of onset for a white adolescent is for drugs or marijuana, alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs. That is 15, age 15. For Blacks and Hispanics, it's age 14. No, wait, it's the other way around. For whites, it's for age 14. For Blacks and Hispanics, it's age 15. But now we're seeing American Indian and Asian communities, as well as Latinx communities, that are increasing their drug use. So we have, this is just different. So what are we talking about in terms of prevention interventions? One is that there should be an intentional focus on school climate with a focus on connectedness and resistance. Surprise, surprise, and I would say that. High tide raises all boats, but not all boats are seaworthy. So where we have climate interventions that we know from the adolescent health studies are preventive, we also know that there are some people that may benefit some from the high tide rising all boats, but their boats are not as seaworthy. We need to increase mental health resources. It just comes down to that on so many levels, in school safety, and particularly alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs in terms of the opioid crisis. The relationship between mental health issues and opioid overdoses is astounding. And so we know that. What do we do about that? How can we muster, how can we get the systems to it? We need to educate teens, their parents, and those working with teens of the dangers of counterfeit drugs. So the point of sale for most of the drugs that the kids are getting that overdose is on the internet. And they may think they're getting Benny, or they're getting some other kind of drug. They don't know and the purity of it is laced with fentanyl, and that needs to be discussed. This toolkit and others that are produced refer to the Tooth, not the Tooth Project, but the Truth Project by the Legacy Foundation, in which they had, if you remember, the body bags that they had had in PSAs, and they focused on and making the use of tobacco. That kids were supporting a big bad tobacco industry that was responsible, and so some kind of public service announcement to educate teens or parents and those working with teens about how dangerous ordering pills on the internet is. We have to reduce the availability of illicit drugs on the internet. We need to expand Narcan training and access. And I heard people talking about that here in terms of the importance. And this is something we talk about, and maybe it's slowly coming, but destigmatize mental health treatment. That if your kid goes in for counseling, that doesn't mean you're a bad parent or that the kid is a bad kid. And that we need to get community partnerships need to be the venue by which some of this information comes out and is legitimized. If the mayor is talking about, the police chief and the mayor and the head librarian and all of those groups are talking about, we have to focus on teen mental health, teen depression, teen anxiety, which is related to the issues. Again, we don't have a causal direction. We don't know if using these drugs creates more depression, anxiety, and mental health issues, or if because teens are more depressed, nervous, anxious, they go to drugs to alleviate that. We don't know about the causal. So there's evidence in community coalitions that later drug-free community grants, that there's a power of it. And our colleague Chris Greenwald talked about community readiness in an article in 1918. That would be a really good place for you all to start mobilizing community members in organizations, raising public awareness on the opioid use, and reducing these are his findings, and reducing the stigma of mental health and opioid use. These are not easy things to do. You know, I can write it in a list of 1, 2, 3, but these are things that we've struggled with as a community, as a country for years. So one of the things that we are doing, and this is something that you all will have access when we get our computer stuff straightened out. We've created what's called a Leader's Guide for School Safety and Climate Initiatives, which presents all the information that we have here. In the middle column, those are presentations that a principal can use to educate his or her staff. We have handouts, we have PowerPoints that they can use to do that. And then we focus on building core teams. We focus on the action planning process, which is, all of this in prevention science probably started with getting to outcomes and communities that care. So the information in that is just designed to be school focused as opposed, but it's the same basic thing. So this will be available online that you can use to educate in those 4 areas: academics and climate, safety and climate, uses, resources, and engaging partners are all things that could be used in schools, but also adapted in communities. So thank you very much for your attention. It's been wonderful talking to you and being able to interact with you and to see that I'm talking not only to school people, because that's my usual audience, but looking at potential community activists. I guess you are community activists, but potential members of community coalitions. So thank you very much. And I think we have time for questions that Patty will take over.
Yes, we do. So for our virtual audience, go ahead and start submitting your questions to the Q&A function. And our in-person audience as well, go ahead and raise those hands. I'll get your questions answered as well. You see everyone's trying to scan the QR code. Well, in the meantime, we do have one that's coming in from online. What are your thoughts on recovery high schools as opposed to individual districts' efforts to provide alternative educational options for students expelled for policy violations?
I think we need to be looking at the dangers of having students expelled and suspended from schools. And we don't have research. We don't have research on that. But smaller school districts don't have the resources to provide that. But it is certainly one that we ought to be exploring. And it is certainly because they can, recovery high school can offer different kinds of resources than the regular high school can. But we don't have research on it. So this is an emerging issue that we need to have more research.
Excellent, thank you. Live audience, who's next? Yes.
Building a team in school is really important.
Yeah, our last grant was the National Institute of Justice, and the goal of that grant was integrating school resource officers into prevention in schools. And what we have done for a long time is worked with a leadership team that doing prevention work in schools is much bigger than an individual principal or assistant principal can handle. And so how do we tap into, and I talked about the informal leaders in the school to put this together. And so our NIJ grant required every school that participated in that grant to have an administrator who was usually the assistant principal, a mental health professional who was either a counselor, social worker, or a school psychologist, and the SRO form a leadership team that was to the charge was to do a needs assessment and identify areas that would improve the school climate for all students. And so some of we were very focused on interventions that were focused on youth voice, on how do you engage young people. This was in high schools, in secondary schools. So you had young people that had phenomenal skills and phenomenal ideas about how to improve the climate and culture in their school. And so to engage those people. And so we had, so that team worked forward. So I can give you the evaluation data on that. And so imagine we have three groups. We have one group that had no SRO, they had no police presence. There were 40 schools in these groups. We had another group that had received grant money from the state of Arizona and had training from the state of Arizona. There were 40 of those. And then they had a group that had also had state of Arizona training, 40 of those schools. And then we did more training on action planning, on creating a team. And we had a coach that worked with them on that. And so after 3 years, the results are as follows. For the schools that had no SROs and the schools that had state trained SROs, there was an increase in the number of major and minor violent incidents that were reported to the state reporting system. However, for the group that was state trained, their rate of increase was significantly lower than the rate of increase of those schools that did not have any SRO. Okay, so a trained SRO, although there was an increase in the number of incidents that were reported, there were significantly fewer incidents with a trained SRO. Our group that received additional training that got involved in the teamwork in terms of climate and culture, there was a decrease in the number of incident violent and both major and minor violent incidents that were reported to the state. And that was statistically different from the ones that were the other two groups. So as I started out by saying, we knew these things, that the climate was important. We had the Internet health study, the untapped power of schools. We operationalized that. We engaged SROs who had a very different organizational system than the school system. And it was also at the time that SROs were getting really bad press. Remember the video of the school resource officer pulling that girl out of the desk? and stories about them policing the front of school for dress code violations. So there was a lot of bad press about SROs. But we found if we could integrate, they could become part of the problem solving process in the school to improve climate, that we saw some huge differences.
Thank you. We have a couple of additional questions that are coming in via the Q&A. Others have questions in the feed. Please go ahead and raise your hand and we'll come around to you. The next question comes from an attendee who works within a health department, and they have been interested in looking into getting into their high schools within their city, specifically to help support education efforts. What do you sort of recommend in terms of an approach or materials to support education related to substance use if you're somebody from, say, a health department or entity will partner with the school to help coordinate?
Well, and can I add to that? And how does that fit into the bigger picture within that microsystem, struggling with teaching in general?
Now, I think that there's some language that is more helpful than drug prevention, because as I said, I had gone in and say, I've been doing substance abuse prevention for decades. I've gone into these schools when I was new in Arizona and said, I want to do drug prevention, and here's all the evidence that it's effective. They would have said, thank you very much, Dr. Bosworth. It's a pleasure meeting you, and we'll call you. Because they have so many other things on their plate. So there's some language that comes out of Pollard Edelman shop at UCLA that talks about barriers to learning. What are barriers to learning? And certainly misbehavior and alcohol and other drugs become a barrier to learning. And if you can talk about, go in and say, we're here, we have some skills, we have some ideas on at least a little tiny or portion of what are the barriers to learning that and we would love to partner you and share our resources in this area. One of the health departments one of the grants we worked with is that the health department came in and recruited kids to be teen ambassadors. So what are the opportunities? What could a principal tell you? Invite the principals to a breakfast. Talk about these barriers to learning, and say, here, what are your needs? What do you need? What do you want? And how can we mesh, because we have very similar things. I have a book on schools as a resource for substance abuse for prevention, and we talk about the similarities between public health and schools. And we talk about public health talks about disparities. We talk in education. We talk about gaps, achievement gaps. It's the same kinds of things, but we use different language. And the principal is, wants to have high test scores, and no cheating. That is the pressure that they are on. And I don't mean to be facetious or demean education or principals, but those are the pressures that they're on from their constituencies, their hierarchy in the state.
Just to add to that, we talked about yesterday how health departments frequently are in sectors that are involved in community coalition. So as part of that comprehensive prevention strategy, the health departments also have access to many of the schools through the coalition, and that's also a natural gateway.
And also, we had an offer to add to that from one of our panelists who's online as well. We just want to remind everybody that there are, in fact, evidence-based educational curricula that can help educate around the topic of substance use. Anybody have an idea where you might find such a curriculum?
Would it be blueprints?
It would. Shout it out. There are others as well, but of course there are some there. Bofin life skills training is one that's been tested in middle school, also being tested in high schools currently, and it does have material on this, as does Project Towards No Drug Abuse. Okay, we have just a couple more questions.
And I may say that if you just offer that and that alone, you will get much more effectiveness if you have a positive climate in which you're on. If you offer it with one of the pieces of a comprehensive prevention program is a curriculum. But if it is the only thing you're doing, A, it will not last. And B, it can be far more effective if people are talking about prevention. If their English teacher knows about prevention and can find prevention's messages within their readings. They can use writing prompts. that are related to prevention science, that they're getting at 20, not 24/7, but more than just the five lesson curriculum.
Okay, so within the entire sort of protective schools model and the system of supports that are built, could you speak a little to what levels of supports are utilized or recommended for meeting the needs of those students who may already be identified as having mental health and or substance use needs?
I think that's where you get into your primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention, or in school language, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 programs. In terms of identifying the student assistance programs, which Ellen Morehouse's program is a legacy evidence-based program. That deals with that level 2, where kids are at risk. They are maybe acting out or having been found with paraphernalia, not in addiction situation yet, but how do you provide those services? Again, for these cost money. That the level 2, it costs money. It requires a higher level of training to have someone. You can't have your average school counselor who is trained in all kinds of things that is going to, without training, do assessments of abuse. So it requires more finances. The higher you go on that continuum.
Excellent. There were just a couple of logistical questions that I thought I'd clarify that were coming in that may also be on the minds of those who are here in seat. So a number have asked about the protective schools materials that you indicated. Just as a reminder, Dr. Bosworth is working on finalizing a website where those materials will be housed. She'll let us know when that is available, and we'll be sure to let you all know when that website is live so that you're able to access those materials on that site. Lori, had a few additional questions.
Well, I just wanted to add, so we've had some questions coming in around when will the protected schools book, and Patty just referenced that, but essentially there seems to be a lot of interest in this topic. And so I'd like to just remind everyone on your evaluation, when you complete it, there is an opportunity, correct, Patty, to leave a note. If you are interested in a technical webinar on protective schools, if you would like to just do a deep dive into the presentation that was given today, let us know. We'll put it together for you. And it seems like we might do it anyway for the rest of the United States and those who weren't able to attend this institute. But you've given us a really great starting point for understanding how important climate is, right? But also fleshing out the different dynamics, the different concepts involved. I do have a question for you though. Okay. This was a systems presentation. How do you define system?
Oh boy. I would defer to any sociologists in the room. So I'm an amateur neuroscientist. I can be an amateur sociologist, but it's bonded. So it has a specific role and a specific outcome that is expected. So like the professional development arm in the school district has a certain mission, has a certain set of things that they do, that their people that are hired there have certain qualifications, and that they, although they interface with all of the systems, like the shipping department has to interface with everybody, but their main job is to get those boxes out of the warehouse. So that's how I would, and I apologize to any sociologist in the room that is laughing at that, because I don't have the theoretical background in sociology.
Yeah, no, we appreciate that. And we have dabbled in and started with an arm that really brings to life systems theory and systems thinking related to this. So we're also exploring how to clearly define it for our population of prevention professionals, public health and public safety professionals that are wanting to do more in this realm. So Dr. Bosworth, we actually have created a poem. You were not here yesterday, but we wanted to sincerely thank you for being the light and shining the light on these important concepts and bringing this to us so that we can carry it forward in meaningful ways. One thing that struck me on her initial circular diagram was the meaningful participation piece and how that really promoted school connectedness. Did that strike you guys at all as well? Meaningful participation, and what does that look like? we struggle with that as a TTA provider, right? How can we engage you guys in meaningful participation, both in seat, but also online? And that's a concept that I think we're going to continue to explore in our TTA activities, but I think you have done it very successfully today. So thank you for shining the light on all of this. That is so important to us. And here's a little poem from the ADAPT and Rocky Mountain High
Oh,
team
thank
to
you.
thank you for that. And like I said yesterday, we wish we could give you bags of gold, but we can't. So we're giving you a nice poem to take home as a memento from
Did you
today.
read this to the group?
I did
Okay,
yesterday.
I just,
Yes.
that we each play a role in the journey we're on. You know, and I hope, it would be I mean, I don't need gold. I need to be able to share this information with other people, not just through scientific journals. And so this is gold to me, to be able to have this opportunity and to see everyone here and to know that I'm talking to educators, public health, public safety, prevention scientists. It's just exciting. This would not be the crowd I would have talked to in 1975. And so that's where, and it won't be the crowd. There'll be more and different people in this room in 2027 or in 2037. So keep up the good work, but we each play a role in the journey we are on. So go back and play your role, or thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Rosser.